Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm excited to be here and looking forward to our time together. And we have amazing panelists. So I'm excited to talk to each one of them about inclusion in the workforce, as well as ageism and sexism and all kinds of isms. But we're going to really mostly focus on ageism today. So I think maybe what we would do is start with just a quick introduction of each of our panelists. So Lorraine, would you like to go first?
Hi, everybody. My name is Lorraine Vargas Townsend. I am the Chief People Guru at A Cloud Guru. I have just wrapped up my 4th week on the job. So I'm excited to be here. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Sheela, would you like to go next? Sheela, you might be on mute. Actually, while we're waiting for Sheela to connect, why don't we go to Lizanne?
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, Sheela, perfect. Thank you.
Oh, I see what's going on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. Yeah, hi, my name is Sheela Sukumaren. I'm excited to join this panel. I'm a partner with Mercer. It's one of our global human capital consulting firms. I work out of Silicon Valley, and I also lead up our tech industry vertical. Excited to be here.
Great. Thanks, Sheela. And do we have Brittiney? I don't see Brittiney. Okay, why don't we move to Lizanne?
Hi, I'm Lizanne Vaughn. I'm going to take a cue from Pat's talk and start first with who I am personally. I'm a mom of 2 teenagers, one girl, one boy, as they identify, and I'm the Chief People Officer at Getty Images. And while I only stepped into this role early last year, I've been with Getty 16 years. Most of it spent on the legal team. And one of the reasons I made this switch over to this role was because I thought that we could do more to embed our leadership principles, especially those committed to diversity and inclusion, into all of our people practices in order to drive a true culture of belonging. So I am so excited to be a part of this conversation today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lizanne. And Brittiney's not quite here yet, but when she joins us, and hopefully she will, we will introduce her. So, and I'll just do a quick intro on myself. I am the head of diversity, actually equity, diversity, and inclusion at OpenText. We actually recently changed it from DNI to eDNI. I also look after all of global talent acquisition. So I have kind of a day job of delivery, and then my fun job of working on eDNI for our organization. So with that, why don't I get started with a few questions, and I'm going to really direct these at all of our panelists. So each of you take a turn on these. But the first question is about, hold on, let me pull up my notes here. And to make sure we're focused on the same issue, I think it'd be helpful if you could provide 1 or 2 examples of behavior in the workplace that you've seen. You're all experienced professionals. You've either experienced it, you've seen it, you've managed it perhaps, that might be classified as ageist, sexist, or both. And what did you do about it? And it, it obviously might depend on what role you were in, but I think it'd be interesting just to define for our audience kind of what this might look like. So I see Lizanne's smiling face on my screen. I think I'll start with you.
Sure. So I've experienced this certainly myself. I've certainly observed it. And at both ends of the spectrum, when specifically thinking about ageism, but it appears with sexism, and oftentimes the two go hand in hand, to be honest, in my experience. What I've observed is younger professionals, regardless of their gender identity, can often be dismissed based on their appearance. An assumption is made that their experience is limited and their voice must not offer meaningful input. At the other end of the spectrum, says someone who routinely has her hair dyed every 4 weeks so that I never show the gray, gray hair, wrinkles, perhaps a slower pace, lead to an assumption that somebody's not engaged, or they're out of touch, or they lack energy. And in my experience, both are dangerous to the success of any organization. And I would even posit to your own family making those assumptions. You know, I just feel like it's really important to always leave space for understanding. We use a phrase often in Getty Images that is, listen for understanding. If we work together collaboratively and give pause and give space, we almost always find that everyone has gifts to bring to the table. There's always something to be learned, and creating that space fuels engagement and innovation.
I love that. It's so my philosophy on life too. Such a great way to think about things like that. Sheela, any examples from your side of the world?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I, you know, as Lizanne was talking, that was the example I was going to bring, which was early stages of my career. It was not uncommon to be the only woman in the room. And I think the way I experienced, you know, lack of inclusion was really exclusion, right? Of not being in the loop sometimes, not being asked for your opinion. And the way I handled it, and it was interesting because I think it really shaped my view on how to address this, was I went back to a senior leader who had been a part of my hiring process. So I was about a year into the organization. And first of all, I wasn't even sure if it was necessarily a gender inexperience thing. I even wanted to validate whether it was something that was happening, or was I, you know, perceiving it. And I think that was a really good conversation because as a senior executive, she recognized what was happening. And she said, look, I see what's going on. And she was not my business function. And she said, see, what I want to do is really create a space for you where you don't get excluded, right? I'll put you in a task force that I'm driving that gives you the platform. So keep doing what you're doing, but let's create this channel where you can show up and contribute. But then she also turned it back on me and said, look, as I create this platform for you, I need you to show up in a really prepared way. And the way she framed it was, this was in a bank, and she said it's a necessary and sufficient criteria, right? So the necessary condition is you have a level playing field, but the sufficient condition is you show up and you benefit from it and you contribute, right? So she did put it back on me to really prepare.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, just broadly, it sort of gave me that duality, right? That you want to correct these things, but you also want to make sure that people are truly benefiting from it, and they're owning, right, the actions that come out of that.
Absolutely. Well, you know, and I think what's so interesting is between the two examples, one is sort of you're too young, perhaps, and in the other case, you're too old. You know, it makes me wonder, like, what is the norm? Like, why is average so important? I mean, honestly, it's kind of like an interesting thing to contemplate. Lorraine, any examples from you?
Well, both of those stories really resonated with me too. And when I think about exclusion, I think about having been in meetings with the C-suite where, you know, I am the only woman in the room, and suddenly, while we're in the middle of serious people topics, we call a break, and my colleagues go into the bathroom and continue the meeting. Talk about exclusion. I really, I can say I have never been more infuriated than the moments when that kind of thing has happened. And what bothers me a lot is disguising exclusion and misogyny with your positive values.
Right.
So one of my most hated values phrases lately is that we assume positive intent. And I'm sorry, but I can't tell you how much bad behavior is dismissed in those kinds of values, and it is gaslighting. And when you're teaching women and underrepresented groups to be silent and assume that the majority has positive intentions, I just have to call bullshit on that.
Yay.
I would say, you know, in my role, like chief people officer, like one of the first things I have to do is call it out, call out the bad behavior, to name it, to coach and train around it, and to sound alarms with the board or whoever else might listen. But the thing is, in this role, I can't change a culture by myself.
You
and
can't do it by yourself. Well, we're going to get to questions on that one.
Yeah. So at a certain point, I think you're also compelled to quit over it.
Oh, Right there,
Yes.
been there with you. Well,
Yes.
it reminds me, Lorraine, I know I'm not supposed to speak, but it reminds me recently of a conversation I had with our CEO where he's a 55-year-old white male, been in Silicon Valley his whole career, and is absolutely a believer in meritocracy. He just wanted that word all over our EDI work. And I challenged him and said, Mark, honestly, it's not a meritocracy. That. And the people who use that word the most are the venture capitalists, the white male venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, because that's what they want to believe.
Right.
It took a while. We got them off of it. We finally took that word off. But, it's kind of like some of these words, I think, and phrases, like you said, assuming positive intent, are kind of meant to, I don't know. They're words that need to be questioned. Language matters. So anyway, I completely agree with you. Let me go on to another question. And we talk about leadership. Since leadership is everything, that is my belief. It all starts with leadership. It all starts with the tone that's set at the top. Have your CEOs issued any statements about inclusion for your organization? If not, what is the call to action that you're using to drive change? You're all in leadership roles to create a more inclusive workplace. And I just have to throw this in because this is really important. It's been very important at OpenText. Did the BLM movement in the past year have an impact on your organization? And if so, how? So I know it's kind of two loaded questions, but and Lorraine, since you're still up, why don't you go?
Cool. I'll say, so 4 weeks in the job, so I'll kind of talk a bit more broadly. I've worked with some great founders and some terrible ones, and their bad behavior and their good behavior seem to set the foundation for the entire culture, right? I'm proud to say that at a Cloud Guru, I feel like I'm in the most inclusive culture that I've ever seen, but it's also because we're the leader in like cloud learning and tech skills development. So if we don't capitalize on that position, then tech will never change. Like we help people enter into tech careers. So it's really important for us to reflect something different than the brotopia or the programmers that you're used to seeing in our industries. PS, we're hiring. So if any tech people want to come join us. But to the Black Lives Matter, I think Black Lives Matter has to have impacted the HR profession. Like we started our profession with noble roots, right? Like during the Industrial Revolution, we wanted to keep your kids from getting killed at work. In World War I and World War II, we evolved to really be thinking about like recruiting and management motivation kinds of principles. In the Great Depression, we filled in gaps that the government let happen to pensions and payroll. But then in the 60s, in our moment where social revolution was happening, we had this moment where we could have been part of the goodness and we didn't. We shifted to focus on compliance. We started to like make sure that people were following the rules instead of changing with society, right? And then by the time the 90s came around, it was just like, how do we make sure companies don't get sued? And that's what we called a seat at the table. I can tell you that phrase just makes me want to punch someone. So I think the moment to change HR and to change companies is right now. And it happened because we can't continue to let our Black colleagues, our queer, our Latino colleagues, our people who are going through gender evolutions continue to suffer under our oppressive and exclusionary systems. And that is the call. That's what we have to go change. And it happened, thank you, George Floyd, for sparking it all over. But God, that shouldn't have been the trigger, right?
I think that's so fantastic. I mean, we had this, our CEO sent the most heartfelt, profound email to us after George Floyd. And it actually is and the reason I asked this question is we had no interest in this topic until George Floyd. Now we have a lot of interest in this topic at the CEO level. And it's like night and day, the attention we're getting. So I know in our example at OpenText, it's a real moment for us to grab. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you just said. Sheela, how about you? What's going on at Mercer? And I know
Sure.
Mercer's kind of a thought leader and role
Yeah.
model in so many HR practices. So be interested to hear what's happening there.
Absolutely. And we actually have been helping companies look at their D&I strategies over time. So we've got a very mature capability there. And actually, we've dog-footed a lot of that, because I think for us to be credible as partners to our clients, we need to be able to demonstrate that we've actually done a lot of this. So we've actually had a D&I strategy and an inclusion statement for a while, and it's a living document, right? So it does get shaped by how our, some of the themes that have been really dominant this year have definitely been channeled into the way we are looking at inclusion, equity, and diversity in the firm. But just so you're aware, our CEO is a woman. So, I mean, we really do take this seriously. And so we have 4 pillars that we look at delivering our D&I strategy through. There's listening, which is really the number one of, and all of these are formal and informal. So listening is a really big cornerstone of that, whether it's through formal channels like employee surveys, but also BRGs, making sure that we're harnessing employee voices into how we're approaching our D&I strategy and actions. Leadership is a key theme. Leaders have to make choices on an everyday basis that signal how important this is, whether it's metrics or pay equity is a big piece of how we look at equity in the firm. And that requires leadership insights because you need to be able to resource that stuff continuously, right? So that's a big theme for us. Learning is a big theme. We fully understand that this is a journey, right? And we heard this from Lorraine as well. We're going through this process where if I go 20 years ago, people managers were advised not to have conversations on some of these themes, right? And so you're actually asking people managers now to have these discussions. And so, it's a change journey. It's almost like it's counterintuitive. They've been told, send these conversations to HR. And now you're saying, no, you need to have these difficult conversations. And even if you give them the tools, there's a behavioral shift that needs to happen, right? So that's a big part of how we're looking at enablement in our own organizations. And this is, again, we have people manager forums where we've actually had scenarios be shared this year in BLM, as it became a really important theme for us to engage with employees on. We helped people managers think and operate through a set of scenarios and come back and share, how did that go? There's a lot of discomfort around that. And that discomfort comes from a place of not having the tools, right? Of saying, what if I say something wrong, right? What's the risk involved? So, helping them walk through that. And so, this is full recognition in the change journey that we have to go from awareness to understanding before we get to ownership and adoption, right? So there's that, certainly that's central. And the fourth area is advocacy. We're very present as a firm in global forums. We've been, we've done research, public-facing research on, what the workforce and diversity in the workforce. We also are EDGE certified, which is one of the certifications where you can look at how your gender equity processes are working. We help our clients do all of this, but we also do it first with ourselves. And all of these are prongs for us to, make sure that we're driving this in a consistent way globally for
Yeah, I
employees.
mean, one thing you said, Sheela, that we did 5 listening tours with our Black employees. Our CEO did this, and we gave him a little bit of guidance on, what is a listening tour, because he loves to talk. So we said, you don't get to talk in this listening tour. But what our Black employees in particular told us was it's never okay. I mean, they've been advised, many of the mid-career professionals their whole life, do not talk about race at work. And you'll be a troublemaker, and what our Black employees told us was, we have to talk about this. And it's okay to be uncomfortable, because some of this is different than what we've all been sort of trained, and we'll never really understand if we don't hear what is going on for people. So, as a practitioner, we did it. I mean, we didn't quite know what we were doing, but we listened, and it was really powerful and important that we did that. Lizanne, I'll move over to you, and then I'm going to introduce Brittiney. So go ahead, Lizanne, if you can answer the question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one as I've been listening to everything that Sheela and Lorraine shared. So much of it resonated with me. I think, isn't this the year where if you didn't have a solid cultural set of values for your organization, you figured out why you needed them. I think for us, we have had a set of leadership principles as long as I've been at Getty Images, and they have evolved over the years. We added one specific to diversity and inclusion a few years ago. This year, we added one on anti-racism. And that was after, a Black woman raised her voice, and we listened as a leadership team and we engaged. And I think, part of the reason that space was available for that was we have worked very hard, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, to create an environment where a growth mindset is what is embraced and encouraged and really fostered in everything that we do. And the reason I point to that is because I think that's what gives you the grace to make mistakes. And the reality is, whatever we're doing, whether it's, working on sexism, working on ageism, working on racism, working on gender stereotyping, any kind of ism out there, it's really about building the muscle to understand language is really important, which means all of us. I mean, I was raised on the East Coast. I can tell you now, living on the West Coast, I was raised in a very different environment where a different language was appropriate and accepted, and no one blinked, no one. And yet today we live in a world where that has to change, and we need to give grace and understanding. And I think it's that balance between what Lorraine was saying about the assumed good being used as a euphemism and a gaslighting mechanism, to also allowing people to understand what the mistake is if they've never been enlightened to it before. And I think it's how do you walk that fine line, because it is a fine line, and accountability has to be hand in hand with that. And so there has to be growth. And so I think for us, it's been all about the leadership leaning in hard to acknowledging our own learnings that we need to do, acknowledging our mistakes collectively and individually, because we all make them. And it's also the accountability to correct them. And what does that look like? And how are we measured by that? And what do we do? And one of the ways that we did that was, instead of doing a listening tour for one person, we opened it to the entire leadership team. And so what we started to do at the beginning of COVID, because we normally travel to all of our offices. We have offices in 30 countries, and leaders pop in and out all year, and we couldn't do that. So we started to do open forums, and we set them at times where different offices in different regions would be able to dial in. And then when George Floyd was murdered, it became very clear to us that we needed to have a conversation with our Black employees. And how do we do that? Because we didn't have ERGs at that point in time. And so we ended up in a grassroots situation where our employees mobilized themselves, and they opened up the door and were gracious enough to give us the opportunity to learn from them. And what we've begun to do is have regular conversations with them, and we are evolving our ERGs and moving to that, so that that voice can be regular and consistent and help with that accountability. But I think it's, for us, it's been a lot of creating the space and leaders actually stepping out in front and really leaning in hard. And that's not been easy for a lot of folks at all. But I also think the gifts that we've gotten in return are, invaluable.
Yeah. Oh, Lizanne, it reminds me so much of one of the phrases I use all the time at work is like, we're all human, and humans make mistakes, and we are not perfect. And, it doesn't matter who it is, what it is, where they're from, blah, 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 but we are, we're imperfect, and, we all try to do our best. And I think the notion of graciousness is really important to, people do make mistakes, and you know what, it's okay. Like, that's okay. Well, I'm thrilled Brittiney's joined us. And Brittiney, I'd love to have you do a quick intro. And I might even ask you the next question. So, but if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are for the audience, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. My name is Brittiney Jones. I am a diversity inclusion consultant with Oracle. I've held many roles at the organization. I was a senior diversity recruiting program manager responsible for North America and Canada's professional diversity recruiting. I have supported our compliance and legal team as well. And so now here I am as a D&I consultant, so focusing more on the strategic consultative needs of the business, and very excited to be in this new role. I'm about 3 weeks in, nonetheless, tying everything together. And so before we move on, Susan, I really wanted to chime in because I was listening.
Of course.
And it sounds like there's a trend here when it comes to these listening sessions. And I just want to chime in and say, Oracle has done something similar. We've opened the listening sessions up to different business units, as well as like a town hall fashion for everyone in the organization to join. I mean, we've had over 500 plus employees, in which we've had our SVP of recruiting. We've had our Chief Diversity Officer, Senior Director Tracy Wade join and lead some of these discussions just to figure out, to you guys' point, how best to support the Black community. But I want to say, the listening sessions have been extremely helpful, but I think the most important part that came for me personally from these conversations was the resources available after the listening sessions. So we have an employee assistance program that gave us counseling, and they increased it from 4 to 6. And those counseling sessions were extremely important to have, because for the Black community, sure, we can voice and have these conversations, but it's important to understand, like, what do we do with these feelings, right? In the corporate space, how do we continue to, move our initiatives forward and move the work forward, knowing that, perhaps a cousin or a relative, right, is going to be affected at a greater rate with COVID, or perhaps, the George Floyd and all of these things. So I just want to say, I really appreciate that one thing that Oracle has, or a few of the things that Oracle has done, one being the counseling. So just wanted to share that there.
Well, that brings up such an interesting point, because I think, this has been a year, 2020. If there was ever a year that corporate mental health matters, this is the year.
Yeah.
And it's on so many dimensions, and it's not usually something we talk about at work. And so, among other things we don't talk about at work, that we are now talking about at work, I think, and particularly the Black community, I think that this has been like a triple, quadruple, quintuple whammy year in terms of, just every day there's something else. So I've raised that at our company too, about mental health, that this has to be a very thoughtful, it's not just, all right, here's 1-800, make me feel better. It's got to be more than that. It has to be something companies, if we want our employees to bring their best self to work, it's not just their physical well-being, but it's their mental well-being. So I hear you on that. Well, let me move to the third question. So in the interest of time, can each of you provide 1 or 2 examples of programs or actions that your organization is taking to be more inclusive? And actually, do we have an inclusive work environment a question if you do employee opinion surveys? Is it on your opinion survey, or do you measure it through something else? And if you do measure it, and if your score is low, what are you doing about it? Maybe your score is high, but if it's low, what are you doing about it? And Brittiney, since you're still here on the screen for me, why don't you answer that first?
Sure. So I'll answer the first part of that in terms of what programs do we have in place. So of course, we have the employee resource groups. One additional new program that has been evolved amidst everything is called a diversity ambassador program, which solves for the lack of representation of underrepresented minorities in our internal and external recruiting process. So we now have diversity ambassadors. It's a global program everyone is able to opt in, of course, with permission of leadership or their manager, but they're now able to sit in on our panel. So we're mandating, hey, if you don't have a diverse recruiting interview panel, perhaps you tie in a diversity ambassador, and they can come from our ERG groups. They are trained as well, and they also have a specific fact sheet in which they can and can't, say certain things. But again, these diversity ambassadors are leveraged as influencers, right? To really showcase the diversity and inclusion that we have within Oracle, but again, to show representation. Because when I interviewed, perhaps it could be all men, right? Depending on the role, especially in the tech space. And sometimes it's not always going to be a Black person there, perhaps someone who is experiencing, hearing impairment, right? And it's nice to be able to relate to someone who has that type of a background, or even just see it, right? To know it exists.
Right.
And so that program has been extremely helpful. And to
That's
see.
a great idea. I'm making a note of that for OpenText. I really like that idea.
I'm happy to talk more about it. I'm actually the founder of the program, and we actually just went global about 2 months ago.
Well, I'm having you come speak to our company. Thank you very much, even though we compete.
Listen, it's no competition. We're trying to solve for the same thing.
And our CEO came from Oracle, so.
Very good.
That's great. Excellent. All right. Well, Sheela, since you're kind of in the middle here, do you want to address that question as well?
Sure. Yeah. So we're looking at, in terms of programs and metrics, a couple things that I'd like to highlight. Representation is obviously really important. What we're working on is across the, organizational pyramid, if you will. So one thing we do is we run labor maps for our firm so that we can identify the rate at which different groups are coming in, from getting promoted and exiting the firm, right? And that's really helpful for us because it helps us understand what the choke points are. And they're different. They're different by career stage. They're different by group, and then of course, when you start to bring intersectionality into it, it starts to surface other things. And so that's one thing which I've seen us do, which is very powerful, because then we are very targeted about how we're helping different groups, and it's not one size fits all. And then leaders are also able to then have more targeted goals around how you're improving representation. One of the things we've done this year is look at certain levels and say we really need to, especially middle to senior levels, we need to see more representation from minority groups, so that there's a line of, there's a clear line of view to leadership, right? When someone comes into an organization, they see a line of leadership for women, they see a line of leadership for Black leaders. And that's really valuable, because when you come in, you feel like, okay, I could grow here. So I think those are two good examples. Pay equity, again, is a big one. We have a very robust program, and we've got a way for us to identify, because, over time, because you're hiding, pay equity can go, they can start to change. It's never a one and done piece. So that's another place where we do a lot of analytics to make sure that, we're not seeing too much inequity, and where we do see outliers, we're filling the gaps. ERGs, Brittiney, you mentioned a big part of how we address, and it's actually, we see it more as an informal channel. We don't expect our BRGs to solve things, because I honestly think they exist as a listening post, right? It's a great way for you to test your strategies. It's a great place for you to hear, but we've heard feedback from our BRGs that don't ask us to solve it, because that's really the job of the organization, right? So it's really having that balance of how you engage BRGs, but don't sort of have them lead with the work, because many times you run into resource issues and other challenges groups like that may face, when actually the ownership should be with leaders and and HR and people managers.
Fantastic, Sheela. Lorraine, I'm going to pass it to you on this question, and then Lizanne, and then there's a couple questions from the group. So I think I might kind of bring in some of those. But Lorraine, on this one?
Great. I think I'll ask you, because I'm so new, I don't really want to talk about everything we're doing, but you asked about inclusive work environment questions on your surveys, and what do you do if your scores are low or high? And I'll say, for me, surveys don't really count for that much. I think that when we send out surveys, we already know what the results are going to come back as. I worked at a place where it was a terrible environment for women, and the executive team decided to send out a survey to ask the whole workforce, like, what it was like for women. And there was not one surprise coming back into that survey. I think when you have a problem, you know where you're getting it wrong, but you have to go do something about it. And I think, like Sheela was talking about, audits are the right place to start. What does your data tell you about how women and men and people of color producing like work are getting paid? Take all of your excuses about age and time and role and throw it out the window and just look at the output. That's what matters. Pay people fairly for their work and fix those issues, not in 4 steps over 2 years. Fix those issues tomorrow if you care about keeping those folks.
That's right.
That's it. And I think the second piece of data is really about promotions and, what do people look like who are getting promoted and getting rewarded? And I can tell you, at least in my experience, if you're using a 9 box to decide who gets promoted or who gets excluded from your investment money for developing people, or from those next opportunities, you're perpetuating the system that oppresses people. You're perpetuating a system that keeps people excluded from our processes. And so I just, one of my favorite tricks used to be, printing out all the successors' faces and putting them up on a wall and making everyone feel really good about like all the high potential that we had, and then taking down every person who was between 30 and 40 and white, and then going like, okay, this is the reality. Like, we don't have any other successors who fall into different categories. Something is wrong in our system.
Right.
So I think if you focus on how do you dismantle the exclusion processes, you're going to get to the right spot.
And Lizanne, before we go to you on this, because I think you're going to have a lot to say on it. You've been in your organization a long time. One of the questions, and if you can kind of fold in, how do promotions and salary increases, how does that, how do you make that more inclusive? How do you make it less exclusionary?
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole lot around manager training here, and there's a lot around, and I'll say one thing, at least for the US, and it's a real dichotomy. We're required to ask our employees about their ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
They're not required to answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard from our Black employees, like, why would I answer? What's in it for me? Like, I just feel like that's one more way to get in trouble. And, one thing our Black employees are telling us is that it actually matters to know exactly on this subject. Because if we're looking at promotion rates, and again, at the most senior levels, it's a smaller population, you can tell. But, when you're a 15,000 employee population like we are, we don't know sometimes. We know if they're more or less know if they're male or female, pretty much, but everything else is who knows. So one thing about declaring is an interesting comment, because at least in the US, if you have majority of your employees in the US, that, people aren't required. And our Black employees are trying through the ERG, encouraging our Black employees, please declare, because that way we can then go run analyses and say, wow, like it could be, Lorraine, to your point, it could be like telling us things we already know. But being a data-driven company, and tech guys and gals tend to be very data-driven, if you have the data, it's a lot easier to affect change, I think, at least in our experience. So Lizanne, I'm going to move it to you on this question, and then see if we have any other questions from the audience. And if not, we have other questions we can ask.
So I want to go back to where Lorraine started earlier in another question around sort of the history of the HR function and where it went, because as a lawyer by trade, obviously my introduction to HR was through the lens of employment law, and it very much was a compliance lens. But one of the reasons why I loved partnering with my HR partners was because we always approach things from the lens of, if you're talking about what's legal, you're doing it wrong. And that should not be the conversation we're having. What should be happening is, what can we do to make this the best place you've ever worked, which has been the mantra of Getty Images since I started. And I will tell you that there are lots of people that have left Getty Images and would absolutely say that. And there are a lot of people that have left Getty Images and they would not say that. And so when I stepped into this role, one of the things that we spent a lot of time, and I spent a lot of time at the very beginning with my team as I was learning the nuances of their function, was really what it would take to shift from a compliance lens to an inclusivity and a culture lens. And I underestimated, in full transparency, just how difficult that is. And so one of the things that we've been doing for the last few years, we specifically chose, and this is controversial, I mean, there are people who disagree with this, to not have a chief diversity officer because we did not want to give leaders the excuse that it wasn't theirs to own. And every leader in our organization and every employee owns creating a culture of belonging. It is 50% of our performance reviews at every level of the organization, all the way to the CEO, are weighted on our leadership principles. And we also spend a lot of time coming out of our employee engagement surveys. And while I agree with Lorraine that oftentimes they tell us what we know, it is the data under them that helps inform the strategy to address how you intervene. And so what I find most valuable about the surveys, others are more data driven and like all the charts and everything. I'm a sucker for the comments because that's the magic. And if people are willing to give you the generosity and the time of their thought and input, you as a leader, me, have an obligation to engage in that. And I think that enables us to meet employees where they need us to meet them. Do we do it perfectly? Absolutely not. Are we constantly striving to do it better? Absolutely. I don't know, and I think that's the other thing that I have come to really appreciate the older I get, is that none of this is a fait accompli at any point in time. It is always a journey because cultural norms are shifting. You know, the conversations we are having today in work, or that we had 3 years ago when Me Too blew up, are fundamentally different. As a woman who started out in an incredibly male-dominated field, I never talked about gender, ever. And that is not the experience of my 18-year-old daughter, nor should it be. And one of the things I have learned is it's important to step back and own that it's a different place. And these conversations have to happen, and it is a better world because they are happening. Is it painful? Yes. So it's how do you give people the tools and invest? So one of the things that we have is a global advisory committee that is made up of representatives from across the world. Again, we operate in every corner of the world. We speak 14 different languages among our employees, probably more now. And we ask that global advisory committee that sits as representatives to work in partnership with the global leadership team. So all of our senior vice presidents and our heads of sales in partnership to drive accountability for driving an inclusive culture. So it is creating that audit function that Sheela was making reference to, how important that is. And so we use the employee engagement survey as just one measure, but then we have new employee surveys and we have exit surveys, and we look at all of the merit and promotion and salary data. And one of the things that we did this year that has been in the works for the last 2 years since I stepped into this role is figuring out how do we collect demographic data globally, which many organizations are not doing. And we did all of the legal research because it was important to us to be able to hold leaders accountable and hold a mirror up what is actually happening. And the engagement survey is just one slice that can use that data. What was most important to me as Chief People Officer was merit, promotion, and salary. And what are those trends? And how do we slice and dice that by gender identity, race, ethnicity, et cetera?
Yeah, well, you are so far ahead because your data is, almost, perfect, if you will. And, Harvard, well, I hear you, but Harvard Business School says that the main 3 things you should look at internally is your promotion rates, the development of your employees, and your attrition rates.
Right.
So how fast people are leaving, especially people in underrepresented communities, is especially your high performers in that group are very valid. We are at time ladies. And one quick question that came in, a little bit of food for thought, we're not gonna have time to answer it, is how are companies dealing with women leaving the workforce during menopause? That's one I have not seen before. So I think there's some interesting thought there. I don't know if we have time, but I'd love one last comment, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. Oh, we have 5 minutes. Okay, we have 5 minutes, perfect. So I'd love each of you, and it gets a little bit to the last question that I had asked, and kind of 1 minute. And here's the question. So what are your ideas to encourage an inclusive work environment that doesn't need to be enforced by HR or other corporate policies? What can and should be driven by the business? And Lizanne, you just started with that, but 30 seconds from you. What can be driven by the business?
What can be driven by the business? Accountability. So how are you holding people accountable for moving the needle? And I'm not suggesting quotas. What I am suggesting is, what are you doing to drive the ownership of your leaders and investing in that culture?
Perfect. Okay, Brittiney, what about you? This is
I agree.
Round table.
I absolutely agree. And to everyone's point, right, the data, and not being afraid to present that data to your executive, your EVP, your senior leaders. They need to see the data to understand what's happening in their organizations in order to change it. I think it has to be top down, bottom up. It can't just be at the managerial level. There needs to be some visibility within all of the leadership levels to look into that data.
Fantastic. And Sheela? Oh, she was on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think lead with experience would be my, I agree with everybody, as we're going through. The experience is important because not everybody experiences things the same way. So the moment you say, I'm going to lead with experience, I'm really going to walk in the shoes of the person I'm trying to support or, enable, right? So making sure that that becomes something we internalize and say, I'm going to design for inclusion, which means I might sometimes design for the extremes. And you commented, Susan, about why is average so important? It's important from a cost standpoint. A lot of design principles we have, cost, consistency, compliance, they all make you design for the mainstream, right? So when you start thinking experience, you have to start thinking about the extreme. And if you take care of the extremes, I really believe the mainstream will take care of itself, right? So leading with experience is certainly a good way to change behaviors across the organization.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I'm really literally taking notes here because I think all of you need to come into my company and just, in a week, fix all of our problems. Just kidding. Lorraine, how about you?
I think I'll point back to something Lizanne said because it really rang true with me, and that is hold your leaders accountable for creating a culture of belonging. And when you think about the programs that you build that grow people's careers, take all of your kind of judgment about segregating employees into, young high potentials or different stages of their career, throw away all those judgments and just invite people, whatever stage they're at. It's no accident that women peak in their careers around their 50s. That's when you start to see women, taking CEO roles and making it to the C-suite. Don't exclude all of these different categories from your high potential leadership development programs. Invite everyone all the time.
That's fantastic. Well, you've all touched on, we have 2 minutes left. I'll do a quick wrap up and then we'll probably get cut off, but that's okay. But the things that I mean, first of all, everybody's doing amazing things. Like all of you are amazing, and your way of articulating your programs and your experience. And I know, Lorraine, you've only been in your job 3 weeks, but it sounds like you've been in your job 20 years. Like, it's amazing what all of you are bringing to this topic and your leadership on this topic. And I think if I were to summarize it, I heard a lot about awareness and a lot about education, and of leaders who had a whole different kind of mindset not even 5 years ago. So there's a lot about awareness and education. I heard a lot about hiring and developing people and mentoring people. I didn't hear a lot about mentoring, but I think I think it's probably implicit in what everybody said. Yeah, it's exactly, Lorraine is big. One thing I didn't hear about is civic action, which is an area we're focusing on a little bit at OpenText. I'm sure you all are, but the questions didn't lend themselves to that. But we're really looking at where we can put the power, both of our software and our money, towards areas that could use support. We're actually looking at a minority-owned bank. You know, we're an acquisitive company, so we always have a lot of cash. You know, we're looking at putting 30 or 40 million into a minority-owned bank, which for us is a small amount of money, but would be huge for a minority-owned bank. And we're based in Canada. It could be an Indigenous-owned bank, but really kind of a civic action around. And then honestly, data and info. I mean, we're all in companies that require kind of the facts, and you know, we get to tell the story with the data. And I love the anecdotes though, because I always love looking at the comments too and the opinion surveys and saying, all right, here are all the facts, but this is what people are really saying. So, you know, that kind of brings it to life. So anyway, I want to thank you all. I think we're at time. You're all amazing. And wow, I mean, I think you've given everybody so much room for thought and for me, action, because we're like in implementing mode. So thank you very, very much. And I'll pass it on to Denise and our other colleagues at Silicon Valley Forum.